Can everybody hear me? Great. So, as you can see from the title, I'll be talking about digital insecurity. This talk is basically a summary of my master's thesis, which I finished last year. And it's about safety for queer people of color in a digitalised world, where I'm essentially exploring what the experiences of queer people of color are using technology and the ways that they keep themselves safe, and also ways that could potentially increase their digital safety. And in my thesis, I define digital safety as the combination of information security, information privacy, and physical, emotional, mental well-being that contribute to an experience of being safe online. So, who am I? And why am I here? I have a bachelor's and a master's in computer science. For my day job, I work as a software developer, mainly with the Store Norske Leksikon website. But I also have a big interest in art, abolition, critical theories of technology, which basically means how society and technology affect each other. I have been a queer organizer for many years. I've worked with organizations like Salam Norway, and I'm also a writer. But today my main focus will be telling you about the research I did with my thesis. So I kind of want to start off by talking a little bit about why this thesis is important. And one of the things I actually write in the first chapter of my thesis is about this particular interview that I found in a book called Baby, You Are My Religion, Women, Gay Bars and Theology Before Stonewall. And it's basically a story of a lesbian woman who was married to a man from 1953 to 1968. And she separated and divorced her husband in 1970. And she basically talks about how, during that time, she was able to find community. And that's what you're seeing. This is a little bit of the interview transcript. She basically had really bad insomnia during her marriage, and she would get up around 1 or 2 a.m. and start calling gay bars. And this was the 1940s, 1950s, right? And she essentially saw this as her only lifeline because she was stuck in a world that wasn't made for her. And reading this made me really emotional because I feel like it quite easily translates to the way that queer people, and especially queer people with multiple marginalizations, interact with technology today, right? Like, it's a way for them to interact with communities that they might not be able to have access to in their daily life. And this is why it's so important, because this is not something that stayed in the 1950s. It is still important for people to have that lifeline. I've had an interest in privacy and security throughout my studies, and one of the issues that I was having when I was studying and kind of seeing what was happening in the industry is that it felt like the focus was mostly on the technical aspects of it. I wasn't seeing the applications for people like me. I took a class called Ethical Hacking at the University of Oslo, for example, and in that class, the definition of ethical was essentially as long as you're not doing anything illegal. Which, you know, that's one way to think about it. But the reason that I wanted to do this thesis was that it's not a problem area that's been widely studied, and I thought it was important because, for example, I had a chance when I went to do an exchange semester at UC Berkeley to do something called the Citizen Clinic, which is a public interest cybersecurity clinic where I got the chance to work doing security consultations for an indigenous reproductive rights organization. And this is the kind of work that I don't see myself getting the chance to do here, for example, because there isn't a very up-and-going ecosystem of public-facing tech work in this way. Most of what you get, the closest you get is kind of state-funded and maybe more bureaucratic, and isn't focusing as much on specific groups in the way that I was able to during this class. So that's basically the why. I have my research questions, and they're kind of long, but essentially I was trying to find out how queer people of color specifically experience safety and privacy online. I didn't want to do this from a point of view of these are people who are not technical experts. I wanted to do this from a point of view of these are people who are the best experts on their own experience. And they're finding ways to navigate situations that are not necessarily super secure, even though they don't have lots of resources or kind of mainstream technical expertise, which is one of the things I learned, for example, when I was working with the Indigenous reproductive rights organization, is that they had so much knowledge that they had found because they'd had to. And sometimes when we talk about how to create technical systems, it very much focuses on who is what we think of as a technical expert and not necessarily as much on what is the knowledge that already exists in the groups that we're looking at, how are they doing it, and actually how can we get out of the way a little bit and allow them to show us what they need and what they know. So my research was essentially it was based in Norway. I spoke to people who lived here. They were relatively young, between the ages of 23 to 33. I was doing a qualitative thesis, which doing a computer science degree was seen as a little bit soft, but that's okay. And you can see that there's a kind of variety of ethnic backgrounds and gender or sexuality markers that people used. A lot of people used multiple ones, but this is just to kind of explain the types of people I was speaking to. They're all queer people of color. I essentially found, I used thematic analysis, which means essentially you look at the data that you get and you find the different themes that are kind of coming up in all of the data that you're finding. And these are the different themes that I found in my research, which were intersectionality and safety as kind of the underlying themes. And then there were sub-themes under safety where I kind of found that people were talking a lot about the way that they thought about safety, because when you talk about safety or even security or privacy, people have very different definitions. I mean, obviously there's like, if you go to ISO, you'll read one thing, but most people aren't going to give you, you know, the ISO definition of what information security is. I found a lot of people were talking about the different threats that they were experiencing, and which concrete things they were doing to increase safety. I also found that there was a lot of nuance in how they were negotiating safety, because it wasn't necessarily always about the most technically perfect way to do it. Because obviously we know that, you know, multi-factor authentication, for example, is a standard type of advice to give to people to keep their accounts safe. But there are also other factors that play in, such as, okay, if someone doesn't have a great memory, is that actually a good tactic to try to give them? And this played out in different ways. And then I also found that people were thinking about how to increase safety in incredibly imaginative ways. So first of all, I was obviously talking to queer people of color, so it's not strange that the topic of how different identities play in came up. And this is a quote from one of the informants, which says that being queer in Norway, of course it can be dangerous, but when you add geopolitics and asylum and all of these things, when people are undocumented, if these things are added, it's not safe at all. And I found that this didn't quite gel with the way that we think of queer rights in Norway, which is that Norway is a very progressive, safe place. And in my thesis, I was finding that people were saying, well, actually, no, when you add all of these extra things on top of it, it's not. If I am an undocumented person living in Norway, on top of being queer, then it means I can't go to the police if I get harassed on the street, for example. And harassment also happens online, right? So all these different things weigh in. And excuse the profanity, but I found that my interviewees also, as a general rule, didn't feel safe online at all. And I'm sure that people can relate to that to varying degrees, but it was very emphatic in this answer, for example. This person basically thinks about it all the time when they are using the internet. And it causes them stress in their everyday. And this is the sort of stuff that I don't see being spoken about when we're having conversations within kind of tech spheres about which things we need to prioritize, because it just focuses on mostly the technical aspects. I then had the sub-themes under the subject of safety, and I found it very interesting to be speaking to people who kind of, when I asked them about, oh, how do you feel safe online, for example, often people would problematize it, like, oh, but what is safety? What is security? What do these things mean? And I actually found the title of my thesis through some of the responses that I got, like this one, which is that safety online isn't just safety online. It's safety in a digitalized world, especially when we're living in a place like Norway, which is highly digitalized. Like, there's almost no way to not be on your phone or on your laptop. When you need to use Bank-ID and online portals to be able to access most of the things you need to function in this society, there is not really a separation between IRL and online. And I mean, people had a lot of kind of the regular concerns that we would think of, like being worried about viruses or spam or data handling. But there was also a very high amount of concern about online harassment. Some of these people had experienced online harassment that was ongoing and had been ongoing for a long time. Some of these people had actually had to go to the Norwegian security service to have their identities hidden because of some of the work they were doing that was connected to their being a queer person of color, or the things that they're interested in because of being a queer person of color. And some of the ways that people also dealt with this was by trying to find, for example, safe spaces online, such as closed groups that were for specific people, or trying to make sure they knew how to transfer information in safe ways. And again, this like hiding of identity and so on and so forth. Some of them talked a lot about the different threats that they felt. And I felt it was important to kind of document those. And again, like I'm saying, some people were doing political work. So I think some of what I found out in my thesis, for example, is that actually people who aren't making a lot of, public statements online, they don't necessarily have the same high sense of threat just because of their identities. And that was kind of some of the conclusion of my thesis as well, actually, is that it's not just about being a queer person of color, it's about being a queer person of color who maybe has specific interest areas that mean that you're very public online about political subjects. And also the fact that you become more of a target because of who you are. So it's a combination. It is not just who you are, it's also what you do and what you say, and how who you are forms the things that you decide to be public about. And again, I was speaking to 5 people who are living in Norway, and people had experienced harassment, targeted hacking, death threats. They had, in their work, been stalked by people, which then led to having to hide identity. And all of the people who I interviewed that were politically active saw, for example, far-right extremists as a very viable threat. So what I kind of found when speaking to people about the things that they felt threatened by was that the severity increased the more politically active they were, which is maybe not so surprising, but I think still an interesting finding. I also found it interesting to talk to them about which things they did to try to keep safe. And for example, some of the things that people did, I would see as a free speech problem, right? People that were very politically active and had been loud online had gone over to being passive-aggressive online with memes and pictures instead of actually being out there about the same things that they used to talk about. And this was after several rounds of persistent harassment. They also talked about going to experts, but the issue as well in Norway is that it's hard to know who the experts are in that kind of situation. Who do you speak to when you're getting a targeted harassment campaign online? Most of the time, the first place that they thought to go to were the police. But depending on who you are, that can be also complicated. For example, in the example that I talked about before, with if you are an undocumented queer person, you can't go to the police because you're actually not going to be sure that they're going to help you with the issue or whether they will decide to arrest you instead. And they also were very aware of kind of the very basic things they could do, such as changing passwords and multi-factor authentication, especially being aware of the kind of harassment that could come, after being public in certain ways. And an interesting thing that also came up is people talking about when they were younger and having this queer identity and maybe not being out yet, all of the things they had to do to navigate being in a home where they weren't sure whether they would be accepted or not. So in that case, they did things like deleting browser history or making misleading bookmark or folder names, making closed accounts and having fake names or pictures online or using timed messages. Some of these people, even though they do live in Norway now, have also grown up in other countries where maybe the general situation isn't quite the same. And I am running out of time, so I'm going to try to very quickly go through the rest of it. Okay. So I thought that negotiating safety was also an interesting theme because there are the things that we are told we should do, and then there is the real life that we're actually living, which doesn't always have the space to be as technically perfect as possible. And I found that sometimes people were negotiating both this kind of technical aspect of what works and doesn't work as a practical thing in my life, but also negotiating being varying levels of open as a queer person in different rooms. And this also applies to being online, where if you have like a more public profile, you might say very different things because you have more family on there than you would on like a closed Instagram account. And that means that they were very conscious about navigating different platforms and like during different times in their life. They also had to negotiate, for example, interacting with the police, like I was talking about, like when do I go, when don't I? If I do go to them, which information is it that I share with them? They often saw the police as a last resort, even though as a general rule, we're told that they are the first people we should be going to. And it just made it very clear that it was a nuanced thing. And I think one of the most interesting parts of the conversations I had with people were actually the ways that they thought about safety and like the dreams or even like wishes that they had. And this is a quote from one of the interviews where someone is saying that we need a grassroots accessible place where people can go to get help with safety issues online. And I thought that was a really beautiful vision because what we have right now clearly isn't quite enough. People don't necessarily know where to go. And it's one of the things that I kind of go into in my conclusion. In my research, I also looked at some of the existing solutions that I felt were out there. For example, there are apps that are made specifically for groups of people to talk with each other in a safe space. There are also different platforms that are supposed to help people with digital safety and privacy, such as Tall Poppy, which gives step-by-step digital safety guidance for especially targeted towards people in like civil society or who are politically active. And one of the things that I wanted to bring up as a new possible solution is clinical computer security, which I found to be very appealing to me when I was in UC Berkeley doing the clinic that I was talking about. It is a way for technical practitioners to cooperate with people that have other areas of specialty, to give people the chance to come and actually get targeted advice and help, because people's only option shouldn't have to be going to the police or trying to Google their way to some answer online. I think that it is actually necessary for people in tech to be able to do work that is in the public interest and not only, for example, controlled by like private companies or state-funded companies. And that's like my background very much has been as much activism as it has been tech. And I find that, especially in Norway, there isn't enough of an overlap there. I want more movements. I want more organizations where people are able to use the extra time that we have from actually usually having pretty good salaries and working conditions, and provide a service for people who actually don't have the same amount of access as we do. And I'm also hoping that there'll be future research that continues off of this type of topic. For example, more about young queer people of color, countries where being queer is criminalized, research about trans people and others in the queer community that are not lesbian, gay, or bisexual, because that's where a lot of the research was focused. And I'm really hoping in the next few years, this is like a long-term goal, to be able to start some kind of digital security clinic implementation. So thank you for your time.